Hi everyone, my name is Mark Upton and with me is Al Smith. Good afternoon, Al.
Afternoon. Is it afternoon already?
It has ticked over to afternoon, yes. A nice sunny afternoon here in Britain as well. So Al and I are from My Fastest Mile, and we're really looking forward to an opportunity we've got to present a webinar on player development in conjunction with Cruyff Football and the Player Development Project. You can see some of the details on your screen there, and we'll come back to that at the end. So I guess we just want to have a bit of a preview of that, I suppose, Al, and chat about what we might cover in the webinar. And I suppose one of the things that comes to mind is, and certainly one of the frameworks we use, is this idea of a constraints-led approach, which is, I guess, the idea of how do you manipulate the task, the player or the environment to achieve certain learning outcomes, or certainly shape an environment for players to develop in. And even probably for me in the last week, I've had conversations with coaches in 3 different team sports around how effective coaches are at that. And I think we're getting to the point where there's a bit of an awareness of this constraints-led approach and the principles, but still a lot of work to go in how skillful coaches are at planning using a constraints-led approach, but probably even more importantly, how good they are at manipulating constraints during a session to hit on certain themes. So whether it's to emphasize certain tactical principles or to increase repetition of a certain skill, such as passing, shooting, ball control, but still in a representative context, or whether it's to challenge players in different ways, or whether it's to try and within a group context to still focus on individual players and what their needs are and how can you constrain an activity to do that. So I think there's a lot
Sounds like a lot
that we can cover purely under that on-pitch practice design. But I guess that's where we're coming from now, is that's actually quite just a small aspect, isn't it, of what you might call a more holistic approach to player development. And there's obviously some socio-cultural constraints that exist that are really important that coaches probably need to be aware of and try and shape in their own right, which even one of them is possibly how this more what might be described as hands-off coaching is perceived by coaches and players.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's lots of really interesting stuff there. I guess if we start in the kind of practice design side of things, there's obviously a lot of coaches becoming aware of some of this learning theory, and there's a lot. You don't need to look far to find lots of info about learning theory. Actually, you don't need to look much further than following your Twitter feed. There's a pretty healthy dose of stuff coming out from yourself and a whole bunch of people about just thinking harder about the learning environment and how we design practice. I guess for me, the really interesting thing is, although coaches are getting really interested in that area, that most of them, when you start having that dialogue and bringing that language to how they coach, will say, oh yeah, this is what I do. But most of it is really in the short term, is how, what am I going to do in today's session to try and make a little change, rather than, I think one of the most important words you used was planning, and really thinking about the developmental plan for the player, and therefore what kind of constraints are going to be the ones that unlock that next step in development, rather than just are something nice to play with in the session today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess that's probably the area where it'd probably be quite fruitful to explore further, and the coaches probably need a lot of help with.
Yeah. And what about, you made I thought a really good comment on Twitter recently too, that this approach is actually more demanding of the coach, not less. So a link seems to have been made between more a facilitative approach, you know, what is the role of the coach, and maybe their role is lessened, but actually to do it well, actually there's even more demand on the coach and their time and perhaps planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, probably the most important aspect of this, taking on this whole approach to learning and development. I think one of the phrases that gets used a lot around this facilitative approach is hands-off coaching, and the assumption is therefore, well, what are you doing if your hands are off? You're doing less, and that leads to all sorts of difficulties in terms of how the coach not only perceives their own agency to act and influence that development, but also how other people perceive them, particularly parents who are watching that environment. And if the coach isn't busy in the face of the players and talking, shouting, whatever it is the parent thinks they should be doing. If they're not doing so much of that, the assumption is they're not coaching. But actually, the real job of work of coaching with that facilitated framework goes on before and after the session. The real job of planning, well, what are the developmental needs of these kids right now, and therefore how am I going to shape this session design to meet those needs? And what are the likely scenarios that are going to emerge during this session that I need to be looking out for to shape how the session plays out? So actually what the coach is doing during the session is a hell of a lot of perception of what's emerging during that practice in order to shape and bring in to bear some of the things they've planned that they might execute during the session based on how the kids engage with the challenge. It's really that the most important thing about that type of approach is that you're creating a space for the kids to engage.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably the other thing that often needs clarifying when we talk constraints-led coaching is it doesn't mean that the coach has to be mute for the whole session either. So I think there's a bit of misunderstanding there that, instruction, feedback, intervention verbally by the coach is forbidden, which is totally incorrect. That the best use of constraints like verbal instruction or feedback constrains a player and can shape and guide the solution that they may find, just as implementing a rule does or changing equipment. Verbal instruction from the coach can constrain. So it's not wrong or right, but it does become important for the coach to make good decisions about when and what type of instruction and feedback to use.
Yeah, I mean, as simple as it is, one of the things I always look for when I'm in a coaching environment trying to help a coach be more effective is not to hear silence, it's to hear to hear dialogue, to hear the balance of a conversation.
Yeah.
So that if a coach is using verbal instruction in such a way that it is very much master and student and the dialogue's all one way, what you'll tend to hear if you just listen without even the context of what's being said, just listen to the amount of time people are spending talking, you'll hear a lot of the coach and not very much of the players. But actually what we're looking for isn't for no dialogue, it's actually to ramp it up but balance it so that the player's actually involved in it as much as the coach.
Yeah.
So really what the coach is trying to do is elicit in the player an exploratory mindset, and that they're really trying to figure out and explain how they're trying to figure out the challenge that's been set.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the indicators I look for engagement is when I see what sometimes termed in Skillac as self-selected feedback. It's actually the players thinking about these things and going to the coach for feedback. So it's not the coach having to provide it all the time. It's almost the roles are reversed. And I know as a coach, it's fantastic when that happens because the player's engaged. If they're coming to you, hopefully the quality of conversation that ensues is going to be beneficial. And I think that engagement is another thing that, again, could spend a whole hour on that, couldn't we, as well, even before we get on the pitch, before we even plan the technical, tactical aspects of your session, is that engagement factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, one of the most rewarding things for me when I'm working with coaches to develop great learning is exactly that, is when they manage to take this approach far enough that the players start to engage with them and they start to realise the power of seeing what it was that provoked that engagement.
Yeah.
That's when for me, that's coaching. That's when they're really getting busy trying to figure out how to support learning and develop a learner.
Yeah.
And that only happens when the coach is brave enough to create that space for the learner to navigate. You're not going to see engagement if you're not creating the space for it to happen.
Yeah. And it's also can be a journey, can't it? And this is another, I think, point we'd want to emphasise, that depending on a player's social background, so family, environment and experiences, educational, the school environment, they may not be accustomed to using their agency, if you like, and actually being empowered to ask questions, to try things, and so that could actually be a barrier. So we'd certainly say that that's why it's important to know the player outside of just the footballer, isn't it? That you really need to understand them in their full context and all the environments that they experience, either previously growing up or in the current day.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really nice reading in your PDP article that went out a little while back, the notion that you've come to appreciate more as time's gone by, the importance of that sociocultural aspect, just in terms of that ecological dynamic framework and understanding constraints. I think it's massive. I think it's a difficult one because it feels quite theoretical and esoteric. It's hard for a coach to really figure out, well, I kind of get that, but what do I do about it? Mm-hmm. I think the starting point is actually to just, as you say, spend the time really understanding what those issues are and what's influencing that kid's ability to become a more self-regulated learner. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an abundance of evidence now that the players that go on to be the most successful are the ones that become self-regulating. They're the ones that figure out how to navigate their own journey and take ownership of it. For me, it's absolutely critical that coaches develop that ability to really view the holistic person, to really understand that person's life and all the things that are shaping and influencing it. And it's definitely something we could spend a hell of a lot more time exploring. I mean, even just looking at the school educational dynamic as a big player in that. I mean, for most of these kids, they'll spend as much time in the school environment, if not more, as they do in the playing environment, and the influence it's having on their expectation of coaching is massive.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it's probably a good spot to end, but that last few comments you made also tap into this idea of, I guess, from the All Blacks, isn't it? Better people make better All Blacks. And I think that seems to be one of the key, if not challenges, motives for coaching. So why do you coach? And is it genuinely just to create better footballers, or is it to create better people? And maybe a byproduct of that will be that you actually create better footballers as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think for me, I mean, we could talk for hours about the All Blacks and the culture they've established and how they live those values really powerfully. But I think for me, what it comes right back to again is when every single coach I've had a dialogue with, even at a superficial level, about this type of thinking and this approach, they'll freely open up and say, yeah, absolutely, I get a real kick out of helping people. Mm. But then all the sociocultural constraints come in, and then we get into a really interesting dynamic where often in an employment scenario, they feel some expectation or pressure to conform to certain outcomes. I mean, there's so much drive in the business world, particularly with sport becoming big business these days, in that real engineering metric approach to development and performance delivery.
Yeah.
For me, it's just a really fascinating area that every single coach I speak to absolutely says they're in it to help people better themselves.
Yeah.
But then how that actually transpires into getting my job done, and often having the security of knowing that I'm going to stay in a job, that's often some of the constraints that shift people in unhelpful ways away from that deeper desire. But the All Blacks is a great example of, if you can get that right, the oblique benefit, of course, is the performance thrives, because you're giving people their agency, you're giving people a really powerful thing to buy into and believe in and own. Yeah. And that's when they really start trucking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's where we're starting to, position our efforts, isn't it? With My Fastest Mile is to help coaches, teams, organisations understand and identify some of those dynamics and maybe where the tensions are, and help them to sort of work towards answers. We often talk about that the coaches or the organisations will actually have the answers themselves, and maybe our role is just to help bring them out, to create hopefully what is a really positive player development environment. So I've just, wrap it up there, Al, and we've just put the details back up for the webinar. There's an address there, playerdevelopmentproject.com/masterclass. If you want to go and register, and we'd really look forward to having you involved. It'd certainly be a really interactive seminar. We've got Dave Wright from Brentford Academy who'll be hosting and facilitating. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion with Dave that we're looking forward to, but equally we'll be fielding as many questions as we can from those attending as well. So really looking forward to it. Thanks, out.
Thank you.